The Untold Dark Secrets of America's Richest Mansion. Biltmore Estate exposed. The Untold Dark Secrets of America's Richest Mansion. Biltmore Estate exposed. December 1895. Silence. Beyond the iron gates, hidden in the shadow of the Blue Ridge Mountains, stands a structure that defies comprehension. Not a home, a monument, 4 acres beneath a single roof, 35 bedrooms for a family of 3, 65 fireplaces that consumed forests. A banquet hall designed for kings in a nation that rejected royalty. Magnificent? Absolutely. But magnificence has a price, and that price was paid in ways the postcards never mention. Behind the limestone facade and stained glass windows, another story breathes, a story of workers who died nameless, of a fortune built on exploitation, of indigenous land stolen and rebranded as paradise, of a shy millionaire who spent more on a house than entire towns saw in a generation while children starved miles from his gate, of a widow who made choices that saved stone and mortar but crushed human lives, of secrets buried in basement rooms and forests that witnessed things the family never wanted known. This is not the story the estate tells tourists. This is not the fairy tale of American ambition and architectural triumph. This is the truth behind the tapestry, the blood beneath the marble. The cost counted in more than dollars. Who really built Biltmore? What did it cost them? And what secrets remain locked in those 250 rooms, hidden from the million visitors who walk those halls each year, never knowing what happened in the shadows? If you want the truth about America's Gilded Age, the real price of wealth, and the dark history they don't put on guided tour, stay with me. This investigation goes deep. This goes where the estate doesn't want you to look. Let's begin. To understand Biltmore's darkness, you must first understand where the money came from. George Washington Vanderbilt II didn't earn his fortune. He inherited it. Born in 1862 into America's wealthiest dynasty, George never worked a day in his life for the money that would build his palace. The Vanderbilt name meant power. It meant railroads, steamships, and a financial empire that controlled the movement of goods and people across America. But it also meant something else. Something the family spent generations trying to scrub from public memory. The Vanderbilt fortune was built on ruthless exploitation. George's grandfather, Cornelius Vanderbilt, the Commodore, was not a gentle captain of industry. He was a predator. He crushed competitors without mercy. He bribed politicians as casually as most men tipped waiters. He manipulated stock prices, destroyed smaller businesses, and built monopolies that strangled American commerce. Workers on his railroads labored 12, 14, 16-hour days in conditions that maimed and killed. Safety regulations, non-existent. Fair wages, a joke. The Commodore believed in one principle: profit above all. When workers organized for better conditions, Vanderbilt broke their unions with violence. When competitors tried to challenge his dominance, he drove them into bankruptcy. When the public complained about price gouging, he famously sneered, "The public be damned." That quote, attributed to his son William, perfectly captured the family philosophy. People were not human beings. They were resources to be extracted, used, and discarded when no longer profitable. By the time Cornelius died in 1877, he had accumulated roughly $100 million, equivalent to over $2.5 billion today. But adjusted for economic share, his wealth represented nearly 1/87th of America's entire GDP. In modern terms, that would be over $200 billion. He was, at his death, the richest American who had ever lived. And that fortune was passed down, concentrated and protected through careful estate planning that kept the money within the family. George received his share when he came of age, approximately $10 million outright, with access to far more through family trusts and investments. In 1880s dollars, this was an incomprehensible sum. Most American families survived on $500 a year. George received $10 million, $20,000 times what a working family might see in a lifetime. Money he did nothing to earn. Money extracted from workers, consumers, and a system rigged to benefit men like his grandfather. But George was different from his brothers, or so the story goes. While his siblings built mansions in Newport and threw parties that cost more than most Americans earned in a lifetime, George retreated into books. He was shy, scholarly, uncomfortable with the vulgarity of Gilded Age excess. He spoke 8 languages. He collected rare books. He studied art and architecture in Europe. The portrait painted by historians and the Biltmore Estate's own marketing is of a gentle, cultured man who wanted only to live quietly and pursue intellectual interests. That portrait is a lie, or at the very least a carefully constructed distortion. George's shyness was not virtue. His intellectualism was not innocence. He was still a Vanderbilt. He still benefited from every dollar extracted from workers his family exploited. He still lived in a world where his comfort depended on the suffering of others. And when he decided to build his dream estate, he carried the family philosophy with him. Beauty and culture, yes, but built on a foundation of inequality so vast, so absolute that calling it anything other than immoral requires willful blindness. George's decision to build Biltmore was not humble. It was not restrained. It was an act of staggering arrogance. In 1888, when he first visited Asheville, North Carolina, the region was poor. Appalachia had been devastated by the Civil War and decades of economic exploitation. Timber companies had stripped the mountains. Subsistence farmers struggled on exhausted soil. There was no industry, little infrastructure, and widespread poverty. Into this landscape, George Vanderbilt arrived with a vision to build the largest private residence in America, not to help the region, not to provide sustainable employment, but to create a personal paradise where he could escape the world and lives surrounded by beauty purchased with his grandfather's blood money. The land acquisition alone reveals the moral rot at the foundation. George began buying parcels in 1888. He didn't negotiate fairly with struggling farmers. He used agents who deployed tactics common among Gilded Age wealthy: lowball offers, legal pressure, and the implicit threat that resisting a Vanderbilt was futile. Many families who had worked land for generations found themselves squeezed out. Some sold because they had no choice. Others because they believed the promises that the estate would bring prosperity. Over the next several years, George accumulated more than 125,000 acres, nearly 200 square miles, an area larger than many European nations, land that had been home to Cherokee people before forced removal, land that poor white and black families had worked, hoping to build modest futures, land that George Vanderbilt, who had never farmed, never labored, never struggled for survival, decided he wanted for a private playground. The cost. Estimates vary, but George likely spent between $1 million and $2 million just on land acquisition. In today's dollars, $30 million to $60 million for land, before a single stone was quarried or a single nail hammered. Money that could have built schools, hospitals, roads, infrastructure that might have lifted the entire region. Instead, it purchased a private empire for one man, and the people displaced. History is conveniently silent. The Biltmore Estate's official history mentions land purchases in passing, always framed as mutually beneficial transactions. But the records where they survive tell a different story. Families forced to relocate, communities disrupted, a landscape reorganized to serve the aesthetic vision of a millionaire who would spend more on a single fireplace than most of those families would see in a lifetime. This is the foundation. This is where Biltmore begins, not with noble intentions or innocent dreams. With stolen land, inherited blood money, and the assumption that wealth grants the right to reshape the world according to personal whim. Everything that follows, every stone laid, every tree planted, every room decorated rests on this foundation, and no amount of beauty can erase that original sin. The official narrative celebrates Biltmore's construction as a triumph of American craftsmanship and engineering. 5 years, over 1,000 workers. Millions of bricks, thousands of tons of limestone, acres of carved oak. Richard Morris Hunt, America's greatest architect, translating European grandeur to American soil. Frederick Law Olmsted, landscape genius, healing abused land and creating a managed forest that would become a model for conservation. The story is told with awe, with reverence, as though beauty itself justifies the cost. But what was the cost? Who paid it? And what did they receive in return? Construction began in 1890. The site, a plateau above the French Broad River, required massive excavation before the first stones could be set. The basement level alone, designed to house boilers, kitchens, storage, and servants' quarters, demanded that tons of earth be moved. There were no bulldozers, no hydraulic excavators. The work was done by hand, with picks, shovels, mules, and human muscle. Men dug from dawn until dark. They hauled baskets of dirt up ladders. They broke rock with hammers and wedges. The labor was backbreaking, dangerous, and relentless. Who were these men? The The records are frustratingly incomplete, as they often are when documenting the lives of laborers considered expendable. What we know comes from fragmentary payroll ledgers, occasional newspaper accounts, and later oral histories. The workforce was diverse. Italian stonemasons brought over for their specialized skills. Local white workers from Asheville and surrounding mountain communities, desperate for cash wages. African-American laborers, many formerly enslaved or the children of enslaved people, performing the hardest, dirtiest, and lowest paid work. Each group segregated by race and ethnicity, housed separately, paid differently, treated according to the brutal hierarchies of the Gilded Age South. The Italians, prized for their ability to carve limestone and set complex masonry, commanded the highest wages among laborers, sometimes $3 to $5 per day. They lived in barracks constructed specifically for them, crude but functional structures where dozens of men slept in tight quarters. Many spoke little English. They were far from home, isolated in a rural southern landscape that was often hostile to immigrants. They worked 6 days a week, 10 to 12 hours a day, shaping stone into the decorative flourishes that would make Biltmore magnificent. Their skill was undeniable. Their treatment by modern standards was exploitative. Local white workers, drawn by the promise of steady employment, earned less. Common laborers made $1 to $2 per day. Carpenters, bricklayers, and other skilled tradesmen earned more, but still far below what Hunt's architects and engineers received. These were mountain people, many from families that had lived in Appalachia for generations. Biltmore represented opportunity in a region with few jobs and little capital. They walked miles each morning from Asheville or from small communities scattered across the hills. They worked through summer heat and winter cold. They endured injuries, illnesses, and a pace that ground men down. African-American workers occupied the bottom rung. Segregation was absolute. They performed the heaviest manual labor, digging foundations, hauling materials, mixing mortar, clearing debris. Their wages were the lowest, often 75 cents to $1.50 per day. They were housed separately, often in the most rudimentary shelters. They ate separately. They worked under white foremen who treated them with the casual cruelty that defined race relations in the post-Reconstruction South. When injuries occurred, black workers received the least medical attention. When disputes arose, their word counted for nothing against white workers or supervisors. The work was dangerous. Construction sites in the 1890s had no safety regulations, no worker protections, no insurance. Men worked at heights with minimal scaffolding. They handled heavy stone blocks hoisted by primitive cranes and pulleys. They operated saws and cutting equipment with no guards. Stone dust filled the air, scarring lungs. Lime in mortar burned skin. Falls, crushing injuries, and severed limbs were occupational hazards, accepted as inevitable. How many workers died building Biltmore? The estate has never released comprehensive records. Newspaper accounts from the period mention occasional deaths. A worker falling from scaffolding, a man crushed by a limestone block, a laborer killed when a wall collapsed during construction. But these accounts are sporadic and incomplete. There was no requirement to report worker deaths. Families of dead laborers had no legal recourse. If a man died on the job, his body was removed, his family might receive a small payment or nothing at all, and work continued. Estimates based on comparable projects suggest that a construction site of Biltmore's scale and duration likely saw between 10 and 30 worker deaths. Dozens more suffered permanent injuries that ended their ability to work and left them with no support, no disability pay, no future. These men are nameless in the estate's official history. No memorial marks their sacrifice. No plaque honors their contribution. They built a palace for a millionaire and were discarded like the broken tools they became. The pace was punishing because George Vanderbilt wanted his house finished. Christmas 1895 was the deadline. Hunt's architects pushed supervisors. Supervisors pushed foremen. Foremen drove workers harder. When someone collapsed from exhaustion or heat, another man took his place. The project could not slow. Delay meant additional cost, and while George had millions, the budget was not infinite. Every week of delay added to payroll, to material costs, to overhead. Workers were the most expendable variable. They could be replaced, pushed harder, worked longer, paid less. Housing conditions for workers were deplorable. The barracks, thrown up quickly and cheaply, offered minimal shelter. Men slept on narrow bunks or straw mattresses. There was no privacy, no heat in winter beyond what a single stove could provide, no cooling in summer. Sanitation was primitive. Outhouses served dozens of men. Water came from wells or streams, often contaminated by construction runoff. Disease spread easily in such crowded, unsanitary conditions. Dysentery, typhoid, and respiratory infections moved through the barracks. Men who felt too ill to work were sent away, left to recover or die on their own. Food was basic and insufficient. Workers bought meals from estate kitchens or from vendors who set up near the site, paying from their meager wages. The diet was heavy on cornbread, beans, and fatback, with little fresh meat or vegetables. Malnutrition was common. Men worked physically exhausting jobs on inadequate calories, their bodies slowly breaking down under the strain. And what did George Vanderbilt know of these conditions? What did he see when he visited the construction site, as he did periodically to inspect progress? He saw men working, he saw stone rising, he saw his vision taking shape. Did he see the exhaustion in their faces, the injuries, the squalor of the barracks? Perhaps. More likely, he saw what men of his class always saw, a necessary process, the natural order of things. Workers worked. That was their function. He paid wages, which was more than he owed. The conditions were no worse and probably better than other construction sites of the era. By the standards of his time and class, George Vanderbilt was not a cruel man. He was simply indifferent. Indifference, when you hold all the power, is cruelty. George had the wealth to ensure safer conditions, better pay, humane housing, medical care for injured workers. He chose not to, not out of malice, but because it never occurred to him that he should. Workers were a line item in the budget, a resource to be managed efficiently. Their suffering was invisible to him, or if visible, irrelevant. The house was what mattered. The beauty, the legacy, 5 years, over 1,000 men, uncounted injuries, estimated dozens of deaths, families disrupted. Lives consumed, also that one man could have the largest private residence in America. This is not a story of triumph. This is a story of exploitation, of a system that valued stone and wood more than human life, of wealth so vast and so insulated that it could destroy people without even noticing. Christmas 1895 arrived. The house opened. Guests marveled at the limestone facade, the soaring banquet hall, the library holding 10,000 volumes, the winter garden with its glass roof and fountain. Electric lights glowed. Elevators glided silently between floors. Hot water ran in dozens of bathrooms. The house functioned like a living organism, every system working in perfect harmony. It seemed effortless, magical even. But magic requires magicians. And Biltmore's magic was performed by an invisible army of servants who lived and worked in the shadows, ensuring that every fire was lit before anyone felt cold. Every meal appeared precisely on time, every surface gleamed, every guest need was anticipated before being voiced. More than 100 people worked full-time to keep Biltmore alive. Their labor was constant, exhausting, and utterly essential. Yet the estate was designed to make them disappear. The architecture itself enforced invisibility. Behind the grand public spaces, a second circulation system threaded through the house. Narrow servant staircases, hidden behind doors that blended into the wood paneling, allowed staff to move between floors without being seen by family or guests. Service corridors, painted institutional green and lit by bare bulbs, ran parallel to the main hallways. Servants entered rooms through concealed doors, performed their tasks, and vanished back into the walls. The effect was eerie and deliberate. Service without servants. Comfort without acknowledging the humans who provided it. The basement was the servants' true domain. Here below the beauty sprawled a utilitarian world of kitchens, sculleries, laundries, storage rooms, and workshops. The kitchens alone occupied enormous space, equipped with multiple coal-fired ranges, roasting ovens, preparation tables, and enormous sinks. A full brigade of cooks, sous chefs, scullery maids, and kitchen boys labored here, preparing meals for family, guests, and the staff itself. Breakfast, luncheon, afternoon tea, dinner, late supper, each meal demanded hours of preparation, precise timing, and coordination. The hierarchy below stairs was rigid and unforgiving. At the top stood the butler, the highest-ranking male servant, responsible for the dining room, wine cellar, and male staff. Below him, footmen served meals, answered call buttons, and maintained the public rooms. The housekeeper, the highest-ranking female servant, controlled the maids, laundresses, and female staff. Below her, head housemaids supervised teams of chambermaids who cleaned bedrooms, changed linens, emptied chamber pots, and maintained the private quarters. Below them, scullery maids and laundresses performed the dirtiest, hardest work, scrubbing pots, washing mountains of linens, blacking stoves. Each role had its place. Each person knew their rank, speaking out of turn, crossing hierarchical boundaries, or failing to show proper deference to superiors meant instant dismissal. The system was feudal, transplanted from European estates and enforced with absolute authority. Pay reflected this hierarchy, and by modern standards it was insulting. A butler might earn $50 to $75 per month, substantial for the time, but still a fraction of what Hunt's architects or Olmsted's landscape designers received. Footmen earned $20 to $30 per month. Housemaids earned $10 to $20 per month. Scullery maids and laundresses at the bottom earned as little as $5 to $10 per month. For this, they worked 6 days a week, often 12 to 16 hours per day, with one afternoon off every 2 weeks. Housing was provided, but calling it a benefit is generous. Servants lived in tiny rooms on the upper floors, far from the family bedrooms, or in basement quarters near the kitchens. Rooms were barely large enough for a narrow bed, a small dresser, and a chair. Several servants often shared a single room. Privacy was non-existent. Heat was minimal. In winter, these rooms were freezing. In summer, stifling. Servants rose before dawn, often at 4:30 or 5:00 a.m. to begin their tasks. They worked until family and guests had retired, often past 10:00 or 11:00 p.m. Then they returned to their cold, cramped rooms, too exhausted to do anything but collapse. Food for servants was adequate but monotonous. They ate in a separate servants' dining room at different times from the family. The meals were filling but plain: stews, porridge, bread, root vegetables. The elaborate dishes served upstairs, the French cuisine, the delicate pastries, the imported delicacies, were not for them. They prepared these meals, cooked them, served them, and then cleared the plates. What they ate was whatever was cheapest and most efficient. The physical toll was immense. Housemaids climbed countless stairs each day, carrying heavy buckets of water, armloads of linens, coal scuttles for fireplaces. Laundresses stood over enormous washing tubs, scrubbing sheets and clothing by hand, wringing them out, hanging them to dry. The work destroyed hands, bent backs, and wore bodies down. Many servants developed chronic pain, varicose veins, respiratory problems from constant exposure to dust and coal smoke. Medical care was minimal. If a servant fell too ill to work, they were dismissed. There was no sick leave, no disability, no safety net. Women servants faced additional dangers. Sexual harassment and assault by male employers or male guests was a constant threat, rarely spoken of openly but universally understood. A servant who resisted unwanted advances risked losing her position. A servant who became pregnant was immediately dismissed, with no support and often no recourse. The power imbalance was absolute. Male employers could do as they wished. Women servants had no protection. The emotional toll was equally brutal. Servants were expected to be invisible, to anticipate needs without being asked, to show no emotion, no fatigue, no personality. They were not people, they were functions. A maid was not Mary or Elizabeth or Sarah, she was the chambermaid. A footman was not James or Thomas, he was the footman. Individuality was erased. Humanity was erased. You existed to serve, and when you could no longer serve, you ceased to exist. Turnover was high. Many servants lasted only months before the conditions broke them. They left for other positions, returned to families, or simply disappeared from the records. The estate replaced them with fresh workers, drawn by the promise of employment in a poor region. The cycle repeated endlessly. The house consumed people as surely as it consumed coal. George and Edith Vanderbilt were not deliberately cruel to their servants. By the standards of their class and era, they were considered fair employers. They paid wages on time. They provided housing and food. They did not beat or publicly humiliate their staff, but fairness is relative, treating human beings as invisible machines, paying them wages that kept them perpetually on the edge of survival, working them to exhaustion, and discarding them when they broke. This was not fairness. This was exploitation dressed in paternalistic benevolence. The servants of Biltmore are ghosts in the official history. Tour guides mention them in passing, always emphasizing how well they were treated, how fortunate they were to work in such a grand house. But their names are lost. Their stories are untold. The work that made Biltmore function, the labor that created the illusion of effortless grandeur, is acknowledged only as a footnote. They deserve more. They deserve to be seen, to be named, to be remembered not as functions, but as people whose lives were spent in service to a dream that was never theirs. Biltmore was never sustainable. From the moment the doors opened, the estate hemorrhaged money at a rate that would eventually threaten even Vanderbilt wealth. The operating costs were staggering, far exceeding what the productive arms of the estate, farms, forests, dairies, could ever generate. George believed he could hold the balance. He was wrong. Monthly expenses provide a glimpse into the financial abyss. Coal alone, required to heat 250 rooms and power the boilers that provided hot water and steam, arrived in carloads. Biltmore consumed hundreds of tons annually. At peak winter heating, the estate burned through a carload of coal every few days. Each ton cost money. Transportation from distant mines cost money. Storing and handling cost money. The coal bill alone ran into thousands of dollars monthly. Salaries for more than 100 staff members formed another massive line item. Even at the low wages paid to servants, the aggregate monthly payroll was substantial. A conservative estimate puts the monthly wage bill at $2,000 to $3,000 in 1890s dollars, equivalent to $60,000 to $90,000 today. Annually, that's over $1 million in today's money just for servants' wages. Maintenance was relentless and expensive. A structure of Biltmore's size and complexity always demanded attention. Slates on the massive copper roof needed replacing after storms. Plaster cracked and required patching. Pipes froze in winter and burst. Electrical systems, cutting edge in 1895 but primitive by later standards, required constant tending by engineers. Carpentry, painting, masonry repairs, the work never stopped. Every fix demanded skilled labor and materials. Annual maintenance costs likely ran into tens of thousands of dollars. Provisions for the household, food, linens, china, crystal, silver, wine, candles, lamp oil, and later gasoline for automobiles, added thousands more. Even with the estate's farms and dairies providing some food, much had to be purchased. Imported luxuries for the family table, supplies for guests, bulk provisions for the servants' hall, all of it cost money. Then came property taxes. As one of the largest landholders in North Carolina, George owed substantial annual taxes. Initially, rural land carried low tax rates, but as the estate developed and the house was completed, assessments rose. By the early 1900s, annual property taxes reached significant sums, adding another burden. Insurance was another expense. Insuring a structure worth millions, filled with art and furnishings of incalculable value, required hefty premiums. Fire was a constant risk. The house had fireplaces, coal boilers, and early electrical systems, all potential ignition sources. Insurers charged accordingly. Add in the costs of running the forestry program, maintaining roads, supporting Biltmore Village, and funding the various enterprises George launched, and the total monthly operating cost likely exceeded $20,000 in 1890s dollars. Annually, that's over $240,000, equivalent to roughly $7 million to $8 million today. And remember, this was just operating cost, not the initial construction expense, which ran into millions more. What covered these costs? George's share of the Vanderbilt fortune generated investment income from railroads, real estate, and financial holdings. In a good year, that income might produce $500,000 to $1 million or more. Plenty to cover Biltmore's expenses, plus provide a comfortable cushion. The estate's productive activities, timber sales, dairy products, farm produce, added perhaps $50,000 to $100,000 annually, helpful but not decisive. The balance seemed workable. George had the income. The estate consumed part of it. Life continued, but the balance was fragile. Any shock to investment income, any major unexpected expense, any economic downturn would strain the equation, and shocks were coming. The first blow arrived in 1913 with the ratification of the 16th Amendment establishing the federal income tax. Until then, wealthy Americans paid little direct federal tax. The Vanderbilt fortune had accumulated and grown largely untaxed. The income tax changed everything. Rates started low but climbed quickly for top earners. Suddenly, a significant portion of George's annual income went to Washington. Dollars that had previously flowed to Biltmore's operating budget now flowed to the federal government. The effect was immediate and painful. The estate's operating costs did not decrease. The house still demanded coal, wages, maintenance, provisions, but the money available to meet those costs shrank. For the first time, George faced a genuine financial squeeze. He began looking for places to cut. Travel was curtailed. New acquisitions were deferred, hiring slowed, maintenance was postponed where possible. George believed he could adapt, the estate could operate more efficiently, farms could expand productivity. The forest, now maturing under scientific management, could generate more timber revenue. With careful management, a new equilibrium could be found. He never got the chance to find it. In March 1914, George traveled to Washington for medical consultations. He had been struggling with complications from appendicitis. The condition worsened suddenly. Surgeons operated in emergency. George Washington Vanderbilt II died on March 6, 1914. He was 51 years old. He had lived in his dream house for less than 20 years. His death detonated a financial crisis. George's will left Biltmore to his widow Edith for her lifetime, then to their daughter Cornelia. The estate included all assets and all debts. Settling George's estate took time and money. Lawyers, appraisers, accountants, and courts became involved. Estate taxes, though modest by later standards, took a bite. Investment portfolios had to be reorganized. Edith inherited an estate that was magnificent, beloved, and financially unstable. She sat in George's library and studied the ledgers. The picture was sobering. Operating costs remained around $240,000 annually. Investment income, reduced by federal taxes and estate settlement costs, was less reliable. Farm and timber revenue helped but couldn't close the gap. The arithmetic was brutal. Biltmore cost more to run than it generated. Without significant change, the estate would begin consuming capital. Within a decade, funds would be exhausted. Then what? Forced sale, creditors seizing assets, the dream ending in bankruptcy and humiliation. Edith faced an impossible choice. Preserve George's vision exactly as he intended and watch it collapse, or make hard decisions that betrayed his dream but ensured something survived. She chose survival, and the choices she made, necessary as they were, carried their own dark costs. Edith Vanderbilt was 43 years old when George died. She was a widow with a teenage daughter, an estate that employed hundreds, and financial pressures that would have crushed most people. The conventional wisdom among her advisors was clear. Sell everything, liquidate the assets, live comfortably elsewhere. Biltmore was a beautiful burden, let it go. Edith refused. She loved Biltmore not just as George's legacy, but as her home. She had helped make it function. She knew every room, every staff member, every challenge. More importantly, she understood that Biltmore was more than a private residence. It was a significant employer in a poor region. It supported hundreds of families directly and indirectly. Abandoning it would devastate the local economy. She felt that responsibility keenly, but sentiment could not pay bills. Edith hired accountants and lawyers to conduct a full financial analysis. Their findings confirmed her fears. At current operating levels, the estate would exhaust capital within 10 years, sooner if markets turned against her or major repairs arose. Immediate, aggressive action was required. Her first decision was the most painful: sell the majority of the land. George had assembled roughly 125,000 acres with the vision of creating a managed forest, a scientific demonstration that land could be both productive and beautiful. That vision was no longer affordable. Edith opened negotiations with the United States Forest Service. The government was interested. The land George had carefully restored was exactly what the newly formed Forest Service wanted for national forests. The sale took time. Surveyors marked boundaries. Appraisers set values. Congress had to appropriate funds. The transaction finally closed in 1916. Approximately 86,700 acres transferred to federal ownership for a sum estimated around $5 per acre, totaling roughly $430,000. That's about $11 million in today's dollars. George had invested far more in purchase and improvements. Edith took a substantial loss, but the sale achieved its goal. It generated capital to pay down debts and created a financial cushion. The land became Pisgah National Forest, named for Mount Pisgah visible from Biltmore's terraces. George's forestry experiment would continue under federal stewardship. The Biltmore Forest School, which had trained America's first scientific foresters, closed. Carl Schenk, the German forester who had led the program, returned to Europe. An era ended. The vision George had pursued for scientific land management survived, but no longer under Vanderbilt control. Edith retained roughly 8,000 acres immediately around the house and village. Still substantial, but manageable. She could focus resources on the core without the crushing expense of administering a mountain empire. The first crisis was contained. Now came the harder work, cutting operating costs. Staffing was the largest controllable expense. Edith began reducing headcount. She did it gradually through attrition where possible to soften the blow. When servants left for other positions or retired, many were not replaced. Departments were consolidated. Tasks were reassigned. The household staff, which had numbered well over 100 at peak, shrank to around 60. Still large by any standard, but a meaningful reduction. Each person let go represented a family affected. Many had worked at Biltmore for years, some since the house opened. They knew the routines, the standards, the family. Dismissal meant not just lost wages, but often the loss of housing, since many lived on the estate. Edith provided severance where she could, letters of reference and assistance finding other work. But in a region with limited employment, many struggled. Some left the area entirely, chasing jobs elsewhere. Some accepted lower-paying positions. Some never recovered financially. Edith was not heartless. She understood the human cost, but she also understood that keeping Biltmore afloat required hard choices. If the estate failed, everyone lost their jobs. Better to cut now while she could do it in a controlled way than face a chaotic collapse later. Next came operational economies. Edith closed unused wings of the house. Entire floors were shut down, vents closed, heat cut off. Why heat 35 bedrooms when only a few were occupied? Formal guest entertaining, which George had already kept minimal, became even rarer. The massive banquet hall, designed to seat dozens, stood mostly empty. Lavish dinners gave way to modest family meals. Maintenance was triaged ruthlessly. Essential systems, heating, plumbing, electrical, received priority, everything else waited. Cosmetic repairs, repainting, refinishing woodwork, replacing worn carpets, all deferred. The house began to show wear, not dramatic decay, but a subtle shabbiness that would have horrified George. Edith accepted it. Perfection was no longer affordable. The gardens, originally maintained by teams of groundskeepers, were simplified. Elaborate seasonal plantings gave way to simpler designs that required less labor and fewer expensive inputs. Lawns still received care, but decorative beds shrank. The greenhouse, costly to heat, operated on a reduced scale. Edith cut her own spending sharply. She traveled less. She entertained rarely. She purchased almost nothing beyond necessities. Her wardrobe, once befitting her status, became increasingly dated. Friends noticed. Society whispered. Edith ignored them. Her focus was singular: keep Biltmore alive. Through the late 1910s and into the 1920s, the strategy worked. The estate stabilized. Bills were paid. The skeleton crew kept the house functioning. Cornelia, George, and Edith's daughter grew up, came out in society, and in 1924 married John Francis Amherst Cecil, a British aristocrat. The wedding, held at Biltmore, was the estate's last grand social event for many years, but stability was not prosperity. The estate was barely breaking even. There was no cushion for disaster, and disaster was coming. October 1929, the stock market crashed, the Great Depression began. Within months, the careful balance Edith had maintained shattered. The investments that provided her income collapsed in value. Dividends dried up. The cash flow she relied on turned into a trickle, then nearly nothing. At the same time, the Depression devastated western North Carolina. Unemployment soared. Tourism, which had been growing slowly as automobile travel increased, vanished almost overnight. People could not afford vacations. Hotels closed. Businesses failed. Banks collapsed. Asheville itself plunged into financial crisis, defaulting on its municipal bonds, a humiliation that lasted for decades. Edith faced the worst crisis yet. Income had fallen off a cliff. Expenses remained, even at reduced levels. The estate was consuming capital at an alarming rate. Further staff cuts would mean the house could not function. Further maintenance deferrals risked structural damage that would be far more expensive to fix later. Selling more land might help, but who was buying in a depression? Then someone suggested the unthinkable: open Biltmore to paying visitors. Let the public tour the house for a fee. For Edith's class, this was nearly scandalous. Privacy was sacred. The idea of strangers walking through your home, studying your possessions, peering into your life was abhorrent. But Edith was desperate and pragmatic. She had already sold George's land. She had cut staff, closed rooms, and deferred maintenance. Opening the house to tourists was the next logical step. There was another consideration. Asheville was dying. Unemployment was catastrophic. If Biltmore could draw tourists, even a trickle, those visitors would need lodging, meals, gasoline, economic activity that might help the town survive. Edith saw the broader impact. This was not just about saving her estate. It was about trying to provide some economic relief to a region in collapse. In March 1930, Biltmore opened to the public. Admission was $1, steep during the Depression but not prohibitive. The tour covered the principal rooms. Ropes and barriers protected furnishings. Staff were trained to guide visitors and answer questions. Edith braced for backlash from her social circle and for the possibility that no one would come. Both fears proved unfounded. Visitors came, not in massive numbers, but they came. People who had never seen wealth on this scale, who had never walked through a palace, who needed some glimpse of beauty in a world that felt like it was ending. They paid their dollar and walked through rooms that glowed with Gilded Age opulence. For 2 hours, they forgot breadlines and foreclosures. They marveled. The revenue was modest but crucial. It did not solve the financial crisis, but it kept the estate afloat. More importantly, it proved a concept. Biltmore could survive as a public attraction. The house George built as a private refuge would endure by becoming a museum. But transformation came with a cost. Every visitor wore the floors a little more. Every breath added humidity that threatened furnishings. Every footstep brought dust and grime. The house, which had been carefully maintained for a small household, now absorbed the impact of thousands. Wear accelerated. The already deferred maintenance became more urgent. Edith watched her home slowly become something else, something public, something that no longer fully belonged to her. She accepted it. This was the price of survival. George's dream in its original form was dead. But something of it would endure. The house would stand. People would see it. That was enough. The 1930s passed slowly, each year a struggle. Then came December 1941, Pearl Harbor. America entered World War II, and Biltmore found yet another purpose. With the United States at war, tourism ceased almost entirely. Gasoline rationing made leisure automobile travel nearly impossible. Families focused on survival, not vacation. The modest income from visitors evaporated. Edith faced another financial cliff. Then the National Gallery of Art in Washington reached out with an unusual proposal. The gallery held some of America's most important artworks, paintings and sculptures of immense cultural and financial value. With fears of bombing or sabotage in the capital, the gallery needed a secure location far from the coast to store its treasures until the war ended. Biltmore met every requirement: remote, secure, vast, and with climate control. Negotiations proceeded quietly. In 1942, the first crated shipments arrived. Trucks rolled in under cover of night, accompanied by armed guards. The crates, stenciled only with numbers, contained masterpieces, works by Rembrandt, Raphael, Vermeer, Gilbert Stuart's portrait of George Washington, and many others. In total, dozens of irreplaceable pieces. The paintings were stored in secure rooms on the first and second floors, spaces with stable temperature and humidity, minimal windows, and controlled access. Security was discreet but tight. Armed guards patrolled, dressed in civilian clothes to avoid drawing attention. Staff were told that important materials were being stored and instructed not to discuss it. Edith herself rarely entered the storage areas. Gallery representatives visited periodically to verify conditions and inspect the art. The arrangement benefited Edith substantially. The government paid rent, providing reliable income at a moment when tourism had vanished. Federal guards effectively secured the entire estate at no cost to her. Most importantly, the partnership affirmed that Biltmore was not merely a relic of Gilded Age excess. It was a national asset, trusted to protect cultural heritage in a time of crisis. The art remained at Biltmore through 1942, 1943, and into 1944. The house, built for beauty and entertaining, served as a vault. The Winter Garden fountain whispered. The library's books waited on shelves, but the halls were quieter than ever. Few visitors, minimal staff, guards on patrol, and crates holding a portion of the nation's artistic soul. The war in Europe ended in May 1945. The war in the Pacific ended in August. As peace returned, the National Gallery began retrieving its collection. Crates were carefully loaded onto trucks and transported back to Washington. Every piece survived unscathed. Biltmore had fulfilled its role as guardian. Edith took pride in that. The estate had contributed to the war effort in an unexpected way, and the income from the partnership had carried her through the worst years. But the war had also revealed something. Biltmore's survival depended on its ability to serve purposes beyond George's original vision. It could be a museum, it could be a vault, it could be whatever was needed so long as it remained financially viable. The question was what it would become next. The answer would shape the estate's future for generations. The post-war years brought new possibilities and new pressures. Edith, now in her 70s, had guided Biltmore through depression and war. She had made choices that saved the estate but fundamentally transformed it. The house was no longer private. It was a business, and as Edith aged, control began shifting to the next generation. Her daughter, Cornelia, had married and later divorced. She spent much of her time away from Biltmore. The responsibility for the estate's future fell increasingly to Cornelia's sons, George Henry Vanderbilt Cecil and William Amherst Vanderbilt Cecil. They inherited not just property, but a complex legacy of beauty, debt, deferred maintenance, and a business model still in its infancy. In 1956, Edith Vanderbilt died. She had lived at Biltmore for more than 40 years, longer than George. She had saved it from collapse, but at a cost she felt deeply. The house she handed to her grandsons was still magnificent, still awe-inspiring, but it was also worn, financially fragile, and entirely dependent on tourism for survival. William Cecil, taking primary operational control, understood the challenge clearly. Biltmore could not limp along as a marginal attraction. It had to professionalize. It had to become a true business with strategic planning, marketing, diversified revenue streams, and continuous investment in preservation and visitor experience. Through the 1960s and 1970s, William modernized operations. Visitor facilities improved. Parking areas expanded. Ticket sales became more organized. Marketing grew more sophisticated, targeting tourists traveling through the region. The estate began hosting events. Weddings, conferences, seasonal festivals like Christmas at Biltmore, carefully curated to align with the site's historic character. In 1985, Biltmore Winery launched, adding both a new revenue stream and a reason to visit beyond the house tour. Grapes were grown on estate land, continuing the tradition of productive land use George had championed. The winery became one of the most visited in America, drawing wine enthusiasts who might not otherwise come for a historic house tour. Each expansion was calculated to maximize revenue while protecting the asset. More visitors meant more wear. Crowds had to be managed. Preservation became a constant, systematic effort. Sections of the copper roof, now more than a century old, required replacement. Limestone needed cleaning and conservation where pollution and weather had softened carved details. Interior woodwork needed refinishing. Plaster demanded steady patching. Electrical and plumbing systems, some original to the 1890s, were upgraded discreetly. The work was painstaking and enormously expensive. Stone carvers, conservators, plasterers, and other specialized craftspeople had to be recruited or trained. Materials were sourced to match originals. Every project began with research, moved through careful planning, and ended under rigorous quality control. Preservation was not a project with an endpoint. It was a permanent obligation. Modern technology was integrated carefully. Climate control systems improved to protect furnishings and art. Fire suppression was upgraded with state-of-the-art detection and suppression systems. Security added cameras and alarms, all installed discreetly to avoid disrupting the historic aesthetic. Solar panels on outbuildings, screened from public view, helped reduce energy costs without impacting sight lines. By the early 21st century, Biltmore had become one of America's most visited historic houses, drawing over 1 million visitors annually. The estate employed approximately 2,000 people, far more than George's original staff, making it one of the region's largest private employers. The economic impact across Asheville and western North Carolina was substantial. Hotels, restaurants, shops, and services all benefited from the tourist traffic Biltmore generated. The transformation was complete. George Vanderbilt built Biltmore as a private refuge. It survived by becoming public. Edith's desperate gambit in 1930 had evolved into a sophisticated cultural tourism business. The house that nearly bankrupted the Vanderbilts now generated tens of millions in annual revenue. But questions remain. What was preserved and what was lost? Is Biltmore still George's vision, or has it become something else entirely? And who truly benefits from the million visitors who pay to walk those halls each year? The official Biltmore tour is carefully scripted. Guides lead groups through the grand public rooms, sharing stories of George's vision, Edith's resilience, and the estate's architectural marvels. They emphasize beauty, craftsmanship, and the triumph of preservation. What they don't mention, what the estate has carefully buried, are the darker truths that complicate the fairy tale. The indigenous erasure the land Biltmore occupies was Cherokee territory for thousands of years before European colonization. The Cherokee were forcibly removed in the 1830s during the Trail of Tears, one of America's most brutal episodes of ethnic cleansing. By the time George Vanderbilt arrived in 1888, the Cherokee presence had been scrubbed from local memory. The land was treated as empty, available, waiting for someone like George to improve it. The estate has never acknowledged this history. There is no marker, no mention in tour, no recognition that the paradise George created was built on stolen indigenous land. The erasure is complete and deliberate. Acknowledging it would complicate the narrative of the visionary millionaire bringing culture and employment to an undeveloped region. The racial reality Biltmore existed in the Jim Crow South. Segregation was absolute. African American workers built the house and worked the estate, but always in the lowest, hardest, and worst paid positions. They lived in separate quarters, ate separately, and were treated as inferior. The estate enforced the racial hierarchies of its time without question or apology. When Biltmore opened to tourists in 1930, those visitors were white. Black visitors were not welcome, not explicitly banned perhaps, but excluded by price, custom, and the unspoken understanding that places like Biltmore were for white Americans. This continued for decades. Even today, the estate's visitor demographics skew overwhelmingly white. The historical tour mentions servants, but they rarely discuss race explicitly. The contributions of black workers are acknowledged in passing, sanitized, stripped of the brutal context of segregation and exploitation. The labor abuses the estate's official history emphasizes that George was a fair employer, that workers were well treated, that conditions were better than elsewhere. This is a lie of omission. Better than a sweatshop is not the same as just. The workers who built Biltmore labored in dangerous conditions for low wages with no protections. Men died. Many more were injured. The estate has never released comprehensive records of worker deaths or injuries during construction. Those records, if they exist, remain locked away. The servants who staffed the house worked exhausting hours for minimal pay. Their humanity was erased by the architecture itself, which rendered them invisible. The estate celebrates the ingenuity of the hidden staircases and service corridors, framing them as clever design. They were instruments of dehumanization. The environmental cost George Vanderbilt is celebrated as a conservation pioneer. His forestry program is held up as a model of scientific land management. There is truth in this, but the narrative ignores the environmental cost of building Biltmore. Massive amounts of limestone were quarried in Indiana, transported hundreds of miles by rail, and hauled up mountain roads. Forests were cleared for the house site, gardens, and roads. Thousands of tons of coal were burned annually to heat the mansion. The environmental footprint was enormous. The estate today markets itself as eco-friendly, highlighting its winery, farms, and forest management. But the core business is tourism, which means parking lots for thousands of vehicles, increased traffic, and the constant environmental impact of over 1 million visitors per year. The financial opacity Biltmore Estate is privately owned and operated. It is not required to disclose financial information. How much revenue does it generate annually? How much profit? Where do the profits go? The Cecil family, descendants of George and Edith, maintain control. They live in a portion of the house and manage the business. By all accounts, they are wealthy, drawing income from the estate's operations. But exact figures are secret. This opacity raises questions. The estate markets itself as a preservation effort, emphasizing the expense of maintaining the house. It positions itself almost as a nonprofit cultural institution. But it is a business, and a profitable one. The family benefits financially while presenting the estate as a public good. That's not inherently wrong, but the lack of transparency invites skepticism. The romanticization of inequality, perhaps the darkest secret, is the most subtle. Biltmore romanticizes Gilded Age inequality. The tour invite visitors to marvel at the wealth, the beauty, the grandeur. They encourage nostalgia for an era when a single man could command the resources to build a palace. The massive economic inequality, the exploitation of workers, the concentration of wealth in the hands of a tiny elite. These are not framed as moral problems. They are framed as the necessary conditions that made beauty possible. Visitors leave Biltmore inspired by the architecture and impressed by the craftsmanship. They do not leave questioning the system that made it possible. They do not leave angry that George Vanderbilt could spend millions on a house while children in the region went hungry. The estate has successfully transformed a monument to inequality into a beloved cultural landmark. This is perhaps the most insidious legacy. Biltmore teaches us to admire wealth without questioning its origins or its human cost. It teaches us that beauty justifies exploitation. It teaches us that the past, with all its injustices, is something to celebrate rather than something to learn from and reject. Biltmore forces a fundamental question: who owns beauty, who has the right to create it, and what price are we willing to accept? George Vanderbilt wanted to create something beautiful. By that measure, he succeeded spectacularly. Biltmore is breathtaking. The craftsmanship is extraordinary. The architecture is a pinnacle of American Gilded Age design. No one can deny the aesthetic achievement, but beauty created through exploitation is tainted. The stones of Biltmore were set by men paid starvation wages. The wood was carved by hands that worked until they bled. The gardens were tended by laborers who could not afford to feed their own children adequately. The servants who made the house function lived in cramped, cold rooms and worked themselves into early graves. Does the beauty erase that suffering? Does the fact that Biltmore still stands, still inspires, still employs people justify the cost paid by those who built it? Or does the suffering stain the beauty forever? There is no simple answer. We can hold two truths simultaneously. Biltmore is a masterpiece of architecture and design, and Biltmore is a monument to exploitation and inequality. Acknowledging one does not negate the other. What Biltmore demands from us is honesty. The estate's official narrative is sanitized, selective, and designed to inspire uncritical admiration. That narrative is a lie, not in what it says, but in what it omits. A full accounting of Biltmore must include the human cost. It must name the workers who died. It must acknowledge the servants who lived invisible lives. It must confront the racial hierarchies and indigenous erasure. It must question the economic system that made such concentration of wealth possible. Only then can we see Biltmore clearly. Only then can we decide what it means and what lessons it holds. Biltmore is not just history. It is a mirror reflecting contemporary America. The same forces that created Biltmore are at work today. Wealth concentration is accelerating. The gap between rich and poor is wider than it has been in a century. Billionaires build compounds and mega yachts while working people struggle to afford housing and health care. Lesson 1. Beauty built on exploitation is fragile. Biltmore nearly collapsed. Edith saved it, but only by fundamentally transforming it. The original vision, a private estate sustained by investment income, was unsustainable. Beauty that depends on vast inequality will always be fragile because inequality is unstable. Systems that extract wealth from the many to enrich the few eventually face reckoning, either through economic collapse, social upheaval, or generational change. Lesson 2. Invisibility is a tool of oppression. Biltmore's architecture rendered servants invisible. Modern systems do the same. We enjoy cheap goods and services without seeing the workers who produce them. We order from apps without thinking about drivers and warehouse workers laboring under surveillance. We live in a world where millions of people do essential work while remaining invisible to those who benefit. Biltmore shows us that invisibility is not accidental. It is designed. Lesson 3. Preservation requires adaptation. Biltmore survived because it changed. Edith understood that clinging rigidly to George's vision would destroy everything. Adaptation was necessary. This holds true for all institutions, traditions, and systems. Preservation does not mean freezing things in amber. It means evolving while protecting essential values. The question is always what to preserve and what to change. Lesson 4. Public access is a form of accountability. When Biltmore opened to the public, it became subject to scrutiny. Visitors asked questions, historians studied it, journalists investigated. That scrutiny, however imperfect, imposed a form of accountability. Private wealth hidden behind walls can do anything. Wealth subject to public view must at least perform virtue. This is not sufficient, but it is something. Lesson 5. Economic inequality warps everything. Biltmore exists because one man controlled resources equal to thousands of lifetimes of labor. That level of inequality is not just unfair. It is distorting. It warps priorities, incentives, and values. When a single person can command the labor of thousands, society's focus shifts from collective welfare to serving individual whims. Biltmore is beautiful, but imagine what could have been built if those same resources were devoted to schools, hospitals, infrastructure, or shared prosperity. Lesson 6. The past is not neutral. How we remember the past shapes the present. Biltmore could be remembered as a monument to exploitation, a cautionary tale about inequality. Instead, it is celebrated as a cultural treasure. That choice matters. It teaches us to admire wealth rather than question it. It normalizes the idea that beauty justifies suffering. If we want a different future, we must tell different stories about the past. Every Biltmore visitor sees the grand public rooms, the entrance hall, the banquet hall, the library, the winter garden. These spaces are theatrical, designed to awe, but the house has 250 rooms. Tourists see perhaps 20. What's in the rest? The basement world. The basement is the largest hidden space. Tourists glimpse small sections, the kitchens perhaps, or the bowling alley, but the basement sprawls. There are coal storage rooms large enough to hold carloads of fuel, boiler rooms with massive machinery, storerooms packed with linens, china, crystal, and silver, the servants' dining room and sitting areas, Spartan and institutional, the laundries where mountains of sheets and clothing were scrubbed by hand, workshops for carpentry, masonry, and repair. A maze of service corridors painted that institutional green, narrow, and claustrophobic. These spaces tell a different story than the public rooms. They show the industrial scale of the operation required to make the house function. They reveal the hidden labor. Walking those corridors feels oppressive. The ceilings are lower. The light is dim. The air smells of damp stone and old machinery. This is where the servants spent their lives, underground, invisible, making the magic happen. The upper staff quarters on the top floors, far from the family bedrooms, are the servants' rooms. Tourists never see them. They are small, plain, almost cell-like. A narrow bed, a dresser, a chair. Many had sloped ceilings under the roofline, making them even more cramped. In winter, they were freezing. In summer, stifling. Multiple servants shared these tiny spaces. These rooms are not maintained like the rest of the house. Some are used for storage, some are empty. They are a reminder that for most people who lived at Biltmore, it was not a palace. It was a prison of labor. The closed wing sections of Biltmore are closed to the public, not because they are private family areas, but because they are too expensive to maintain for public access. These wings have been mothballed. Furniture is draped in sheets. Shutters are closed. Dust accumulates. The house is so large that even with millions in annual revenue, the estate cannot afford to preserve and present every room. These closed spaces are melancholy. They feel like ruins within a living building. They remind us that even now, even with all the resources tourism brings, Biltmore is too large to sustain fully. George built on a scale that remains, a century later, barely manageable. The Archives Biltmore has extensive archives, construction records, payroll ledgers, correspondence, photographs, household accounts. Some are accessible to researchers by appointment. Many are not. The estate controls access and decides what is revealed. What is in those restricted files? Full records of worker deaths and injuries, evidence of labor disputes, correspondence revealing George's or Edith's private thoughts about race, class, and inequality, financial records that would clarify the true cost and profitability of the estate. We don't know. The estate has no obligation to disclose, and it has not. This archival secrecy is troubling. Biltmore is a significant historical site. It is marketed as a cultural treasure, yet the family retains total control over the historical record. They decide what story is told. That is a form of power that goes beyond property ownership. It is the power to shape history itself. Every old house has ghost stories. Biltmore is no exception. Locals and staff whisper about strange occurrences, footsteps in empty corridors, doors that open and close without explanation, cold spots in certain rooms, figures glimpsed in windows late at night. The estate downplays these stories, not wanting to seem frivolous, but the rumors persist. And beneath the supernatural tales, there are real mysteries, questions about Biltmore's history that remain unanswered. The pool room deaths. Biltmore has an indoor pool, a rarity in 1895. It is drained now, no longer used, but rumors claim that people died in that pool. Accidental drownings, something more sinister. The estate has never confirmed or denied these stories. If deaths occurred, they are not part of the official history. The sealed rooms. Some claim there are rooms in Biltmore that are permanently sealed, bricked up, or locked with no intention of ever reopening them. Why? What is in them? Structural damage, mold, or something the family does not want discovered? There is no verification, only rumor. But the house is so large, with so many rooms closed to the public, that it is impossible to disprove. George's death. George Vanderbilt died in Washington, D.C., in March 1914 from complications following emergency appendicitis surgery. That is the official story. But some have questioned the timeline and circumstances. George was in Washington for medical consultations. Why there and not closer to home? Why did the condition worsen so suddenly? Was there negligence? Could there have been something more? There is no evidence of foul play, but the questions linger. Edith's decisions. Edith made choices that saved Biltmore but also benefited the family financially. The land sale to the federal government was necessary, but did Edith negotiate the best price, or was she pressured into a deal that favored the government? When she opened the house to tourists, were there other options she refused to consider? Did financial desperation force her hand, or did she see an opportunity to transform the estate into a profitable business? We cannot know her private thoughts. But the fact that the estate remains private, controlled by her descendants, and generates substantial revenue raises questions about motivation. Was preservation the goal, or was maintaining family wealth the goal? Perhaps both. Perhaps the two cannot be separated. The workers who vanished. Construction records are incomplete. Payroll ledgers have gaps. Some workers appear for weeks or months, then disappear from the records with no explanation. Did they leave for other jobs, die? Were they dismissed and sent away with no record? In an era with little documentation of working-class lives, people could vanish without trace. How many workers passed through Biltmore, labored on its construction or in its service, and left no mark in history? These are the ghosts, not supernatural spirits but unrecorded lives. People who gave their labor, sometimes their health, sometimes their lives, to build and maintain Biltmore. They are invisible in the official history. They are the true ghosts haunting the mansion. We return to the question asked at the beginning: who paid for Biltmore? The answer is everyone except George Vanderbilt. Workers paid with their labor, their health, and sometimes their lives. Servants paid with years of exhausting, invisible service. Families displaced from their land paid with their homes and livelihoods. The Cherokee, removed decades earlier, paid with their homeland. Taxpayers, once the income tax was established, paid a share. Edith paid with her privacy, her comfort, and the transformation of her home into a public spectacle. George paid with money, but that money was not earned. It was inherited, extracted from workers and consumers his grandfather exploited. George's contribution was vision. He imagined Biltmore. He hired the architects and designers. He made decisions about stone and wood and layout, but he did not pay the true cost. He paid dollars. Others paid in sweat, suffering, and sacrifice. What did that suffering buy? A house. A beautiful, magnificent, extraordinary house. A house that has inspired millions. A house that employed thousands. A house that preserved forests and demonstrated scientific forestry. A house that protected national art treasures during war. A house that became a cultural landmark. But also a house built on stolen land. A house maintained by invisible servants. A house that celebrates inequality. A house that romanticizes an era of brutal exploitation. A house whose beauty rests on a foundation of suffering. Biltmore is both. It is achievement and atrocity, masterpiece and monument to exploitation. We can admire the craftsmanship while condemning the system that made it possible. We can appreciate the preservation while demanding a full accounting of the cost. We can visit, learn, and be inspired while refusing to accept the sanitized narrative. The untold dark secrets of Biltmore are not supernatural. They are human. They are the secrets of inequality, exploitation, erasure, and the assumption that beauty justifies any cost. These secrets are uncomfortable. The estate would prefer we not think about them. But history is not comfortable. Truth is not comfortable. Biltmore teaches us that beauty alone is not enough. Dreams built on exploitation are fragile. Wealth concentrated in a few hands warps society. Invisibility is a tool of oppression. And the past, no matter how beautiful, must be confronted honestly if we hope to build a better future. The mansion still stands. Visitors still come. The ghosts still whisper. And the question remains, what price are we willing to pay for beauty? What suffering are we willing to ignore? And when we walk through those magnificent halls, will we see only the marble and oak? Or will we see the hands that carved them, the lives that made them possible, and the cost that was never fully counted? The choice is ours. If this investigation opened your eyes to the hidden history of America's Gilded Age, if it made you question the stories we tell about wealth and power, then share it. Comment below with your thoughts. Did this change how you see Biltmore? What other American landmarks hide dark secrets behind beautiful facades? The Breakers in Newport, Hearst Castle in California, Lyndhurst on the Hudson, Winterthur in Delaware. Each of these estates has a similar story: brilliant architecture, immense wealth, and human costs that have been carefully erased. Which should we investigate next? Tell me in the comments. Hit subscribe if you want more deep investigations that go beyond the surface, that refuse to accept sanitized history, that demand truth even when it is uncomfortable. This channel exists to expose what powerful people want hidden. Your support makes it possible. Your engagement sends a message that this work matters. And if you are near Asheville, visit Biltmore, walk those halls, admire the beauty, but remember the workers who died building it. Remember the servants who lived invisible lives. Remember the land that was taken and the people who were displaced. Remember the full story, not just the one the estate wants you to see. History is not neutral. The past shapes the present. The stories we tell matter. And the truth, no matter how dark, is always worth pursuing. Thank you for watching. Thank you for thinking. Thank you for demanding more than the official narrative. I'll see you in the next investigation. Until then, question everything, especially the beautiful lies.